Hello, and welcome to the Canadian Philosophy Show. I'm your host or co-host today, Hale Rothery, and here today with me is Michael Caditz, and we are going to be discussing um, perhaps one of the most famous philosophical tracts in the Western canon, from perhaps one of the most important books in uh, Western culture. We'll be talking about the Allegory of the Cave from Plato's Republic. And I really think it can't be overstated. And I think for anybody who's taken any kind of philosophy course or anything like that, this is a very, very, very well-known piece of philosophical writing. Um, it's been examined and re-examined and interpreted and reinterpreted over and over again from basically every avenue of Western philosophy, and it's still talked about today. And so we're going to kind of go over what the allegory of the cave is for those of you who might not know, and then we're going to discuss a little bit about its intricacies and our kind of beliefs or knowledge about what's going on there. So Plato has Socrates, and for those of you who don't know, Plato's works, the Republic included, are always written as dialogues where Socrates is the main interlocutor. Plato has Socrates posit an allegory, and the allegory goes something like this. We can imagine a cave, a deep, dark cave. And at the end of the cave, there are a community of people, perhaps several, perhaps only, perhaps many, it doesn't really matter. And they're all chained facing the cave wall. And they've been like that since the day they were born. They've never been outside the cave, they've never not faced the wall. Behind them is a fire that projects light onto the cave wall. And in between them and the fire is a road. And on that road, people carry puppets, cutouts, caricatures of things that we know in the real world. Stuff like horses and other people, plants, tools, whatever it might be. And so as they pass down the road carrying these caricatures, and some of them make noises, some of them talk, some of them babble, it projects a shadow onto the cave wall. And so for our people who are chained to the cave wall, this is all they've ever seen. They see the shadows of caricatures passing between them and the fire. Then Socrates posits, what if one of these people was to escape? Was to get out of his chains and turn around? Well, first, he would be blinded by the fire that he sees. He would be dazzled, as it's often put, and confused. But what if he was guided further out of the cave, passing the road, passing the fire, and seeing a much stronger light coming from the cave entrance? And as he would have to climb and craggle out of the cave, he would come to the real world, where then he would be, or the world, I'll say the world outside of the cave, where he would be even more blinded. And he would have to again look at the shadows of actual things, the shadows of trees, of houses, of boulders, of animals. And that's what he would know. He would first know those shadows. And then he would look at perhaps a body of water and see the reflections with a little more clarity. And as his eyes adjusted, he would then start to see the things themselves, the trees, the animals, the people walking around, all this stuff that he never knew was there outside of the cave. And if he spent enough time adjusting, if he spent enough time getting to know the things around him, he might be able to look up and see the sun itself, projecting the light that makes all these things visible. This probably all sounds rather strange. What do you mean there's people chained up at the end of a cave? What do you mean there's a upward pathway to get out of this cave, and there's a fire in there with some kind of road that people carry puppets on. Um, what do you mean that he's going to get up there and try and look at the sun? Who looks at the sun? You're going to burn your retinas. The point of this is that, again, it's an allegory, it's a metaphor, and the metaphor, I think, in the simplest terms, looks something like this. The world that we know is a world of shadows. The world that we know is a world of illusions, of of items and personifications that come and go, and we don't even know the things that they're really a reflection of, let alone the the sun, really, that makes all things possible. And human beings have the potential to go through a transition of knowledge from a sort of ignorance to a kind of belief, and eventually to what Plato and Socrates considers true, genuine knowledge, which is knowledge of the sun, knowledge of that thing that makes all things possible, that makes all things what they are, often translated as the forms, or more specifically, the form of the good. So we're going to chat a little bit about this allegory, because it's certainly, especially for people who haven't heard of it before, it certainly seems strange, and I know many people who have heard it many times who still are a little unsure, and a lot of people think that it paints a relatively accurate picture, and a lot of people think that it is a little out to lunch. So why don't we get into it a little bit, Michael? How do you feel about Plato's cave, and what we've said so far?
I'm really struck by the concept that the sun represents the form of good. We throw the word good around a lot, and we throw the word bad around a lot. But what are good and bad? What do they mean? Where do they come from? That's an ongoing debate. Like, what makes something intrinsically bad, or what makes something intrinsically good? We might enjoy pleasure, and we might not enjoy pain. But what's intrinsically bad about pain, and intrinsically good about pleasure? Well, Plato gives us some insight into good, in that good is a form, and it's represented by the sun. So Plato, of course, talks about forms. His theory of forms is one of his major theories. And briefly, the idea of forms, the theory of forms, is that everything that you can think of, everything, a person, an animal, a tree, whatever it might be, and even concepts, have in the world of forms, have a perfect origin. The form of a tree, the form of a person, the form of a cow, the form of a dog. That in that world of forms lies the perfect blueprint, the absolute, perfection. But all we experience here in our everyday world are copies, imperfect copies of people, imperfect copies of dogs and cows and trees. But the form from where they originate would be the perfect example. So what is good? What's good and what's bad? Well, good has a form, because in Plato's theory, everything must have a form. Everything that exists must have a form, the perfect form, and that form of good is synonymous with the sun. The sun is good, and the sun illuminates everything. We couldn't see anything. We couldn't function. We wouldn't know what existed in the world if it weren't for the illumination of the sun, and that's what makes the sun the form of good. So back to the cave allegory, when the person escapes the cave and gets out and finally is able to understand that what's happening is the sun is illuminating the real things, the trees and the animals and so on, and these aren't shadows anymore, but these are the actual things. He or she can see these things because of the illumination of the sun, of the good. And so that's what impacts me a lot about the allegory, Hale, is the idea of the form of the good, in that it's truth. So we could say that there's sort of these are synonyms, right? Good, sun, truth.
Yeah.
And reality. These are all synonymous. And that's what makes something good, is when you see the actual thing itself, and you understand that furthermore that the thing is an imperfect copy of the form, and the sun is the leader, right, of the world of
Yeah.
forms.
I think what you're saying, Michael, really wants me to bring up, what for me at least, from my interpretation, is a really important part of both the allegory, but also Plato's theory more generally, which is that this, and very much, it's very obvious this is concerned with knowledge, and we'll get into it more. But to start off, I'll say for Plato, at least from my interpretation, knowledge is always determined by what it's of. And what I mean by that is, for Plato, you cannot have knowledge of something that is ephemeral, that is inconsistent, that is changing. Knowledge is always of the things themselves, and the real things themselves are the forms. And if you get basically wise enough, then you see truth, capital T truth, the sun, like you're saying. So I think when we look at the cave, we think about the cave, I think we look at a transition. And this transition is shown through some other allegories as well, in Plato's Republic, where we go from a transition of ignorance to belief or opinion to knowledge. And what I mean by that is, at the beginning, we're ignorant. What we're concerned with are things that only change. And we think that change is the only thing that's consistent. The shadows, they come and go, they make different noises. We can kind of, Plato talks about, in the allegory talks about, people, the people who are chained up, they make games and issue awards to those who can the best infer and interpret the shadows and all this kind of stuff. But those interpretations are always different. They're always changing. And it's just kind of medley of stuff. There's no firm ground there. And as we start to move out, as we get unchained, we move out of the cave, we start to see the fire, we see that there's this whole setup there, then we start to move up the upward path, and we come out into the sun. We begin to enter a world of belief, where we, in a sense, if I come out of the cave and I see a horse, I both think of the horse as that horse there, that's a horse. I make the claim that that's a horse. But then I also become affiliated with the horse form. And I think for Plato, what's going on there is that we are then in a place of cognition where we're dealing with now both the false and the true, where and perhaps we conflate them a little bit, but we start to get the grasp that there's things in the world, and we still think those things are really actual things. But we also are starting to get the grasp on the fact that there's something that's always consistent about everything that ever is, ever was, and ever will be. And eventually, from there, we move to real knowledge, where we're then, like it kind of says, we're able to look at the sun. And I think for that's that transition that Plato's looking to make here, that, hey, like, you guys, like, you're all concerned with ephemeral stuff. You're all concerned with changing stuff. You're all concerned with shadows, and you need to start doing the work. You need to start doing the mental, the philosophical exercise to come to know the things that really are, to come to know the form of the good. So yeah, that's what's really popping out to me when I relook at this allegory.
Incidentally, actually more significantly than incidentally, this theory of Plato's and the allegory of the cave is a very important part of Western metaphysics,
Mm-hmm.
to the extent that Western metaphysics is inspired by or even originated in religious Catholic religion,
Mm-hmm.
because what's called Platonism in the medieval times is the adoption of this cave allegory and the theory of forms and so on by some influential Catholic figures such as St. Augustine. So St. Augustine adopted this idea of the good, or it was called the bonum in
Hmm.
medieval times, because one of the foundations, one of the pillars, I believe, of Christianity is of course God, monotheism, and
Yeah.
God, according to Christian theology, is synonymous with good,
Hmm.
because religion has to justify, well, again, as I was saying before, what makes something innately good and what makes something innately bad. Why is God good and the devil bad? And the answer is found in Platonic theory, right? Which is that good is that which is true. So good equals truth, equals God, equals Son. And you can trace this from Plato's theory, from the Allegory of the Cave, all the way into medieval times, where it reemerges with Platonism as adopted by St. Augustine and then injected into the Christian theology, and continuing today in the Judeo-Christian world. I would assert that we view God as good and evil as bad and the devil as bad, and there's different iterations of evil and the devil depending on which branch of Christianity and even which religion, but there's still the idea that there's something innately good in the world, and that's represented by God and by the Son, and comes from Plato, comes from this Allegory of the Cave. It's very significant.
Yeah, and you know what? And I really, really like that you brought that up, because I think that is it's hugely important, and you're absolutely right for Western metaphysics and for Western theology. Uh, Plato, and particularly the cave and the theory of the form of the good, um, has had a huge impact on particularly Christian conceptions. I've heard it many times said before, but the two most important works in the Western canon are the Bible and the Republic. And the Republic has had a massive impact on the Bible. Um, that being said, I, I I think that, and this is jumping a little bit out of the Republic here. I think that Plato was perhaps the earliest, um, critic of the theory of the forms, and perhaps on another episode we'll get into that. But I also think that that and this is the theological interpretation of the cave. It sort of goes something like this: the cave is transcendental. It that when we get out of the realm of the forms, like we can think about the cave as our regular everyday world. It's our physical world. It's the stuff that we regularly deal with. We go up the upward path. We come out of the physical world and we transcend into the metaphysical world or the spiritual world. And we're confronted with the form of the good. Like you said, it's often kind of conflated in, theological philosophy as God. Um, and I'm not totally convinced that that is absolutely the path that later theologians and philosophers took in Platonism as a school, and especially into the early and mid Middle Ages. Um, but I'm not totally convinced that that was Plato's view. I want to pause it and say that um, Plato, I don't know if he was so clear about there being a separate realm of the forms. It seems in some places, and this is one of the interesting things about Plato for our listeners, is that Plato's work is there's a lot of inconsistencies and a lot of changes between his different works. And so my interpretation, at least of the cave, is a little bit more strictly philosophical, in that he talks about how hard the whole process is. He emphasizes over and over again in the allegory that it's not some snap bolt of lightning, that you don't come out and suddenly you've arrived at the pearly gates of knowledge and you've got it all figured out and you've transcended. he talks about it being a constant battle for the person who becomes unchained. They don't want to leave. They're confused. The road to get out of the cave is difficult, and it's trying. And then once you get out, it's even more difficult and it's more trying. And people want to go back. They want to run away. And what I think he's talking about there, I think the metaphor is saying is that philosophy is a difficult discipline. But at the end of the day, it's a discipline of examining reality, not of leaving reality, but of getting to, for at least Plato, the core elements of what makes, what you might say, to use some later metaphysical jargon, the grounds for the possibility of everything that, for everything that is. So, yeah, I at least that's the interpretation that I take. That I think he was being a little more strictly philosophical than he gets taken by later Christian thinkers. Yeah, that he thinks that there isn't quite the separation between the metaphysical spiritual world and the physical world. There's certainly a separation in the way in which we live our lives and the attitudes and the kind of thinking that we take to things. No question about it. But I'm not so sure that the separation is worldly as much as it's about how the kind of work that we want to do.
Speaking of philosophy, I can see a epistemological value in a relevance, I should say, in this Plato's Allegory of the Cave. So for those listeners who aren't familiar with epistemology, it's the study of knowledge. Like how do we, what qualifies as knowledge? What's our justification for claiming we know something? What's truth versus untruth? So that's a brief definition of epistemology. So in general, there are three theories, or at least three general theories of knowledge. What constitutes knowledge? One is that knowledge is a belief which conforms to the world as it actually is, as the world is unto itself. And another is that knowledge is that which is useful, beliefs that are useful, beliefs that work. Whether or not they correspond to the world in itself is sort of irrelevant in this coherence theory of knowledge. I'm sorry, in the pragmatic theory of knowledge. To go back, the first theory of knowledge is the coherence theory of knowledge. So a belief that coheres to the world in itself would be considered knowledge. The second that I'm talking about is the pragmatic theory of knowledge, which is that knowledge which is useful, that works, that makes society function. That's true. That's true knowledge, regardless of whether the world in itself is like that. Maybe a advocate of pragmatic theory of knowledge would argue that we have no way of knowing what the world is like, if it's like anything, right? All we know is what works for us. And then the third theory of knowledge is the coherence theory of knowledge, which is that states that beliefs are true and they're considered knowledge, and you are considered knowledgeable if your beliefs cohere with the body of knowledge that's already out there. So we can find, we can punch holes in each of these theories of knowledge. And I'm not about to argue for one over another, but what I am going to claim here is that, in my view, Plato's Allegory of the Cave leads us to a correspondence theory of knowledge, because the Allegory of the Cave clearly suggests that there is truth out there. If you go out of the cave and you discover that there's a sun, and the sun is illuminating objects, and those are the actual objects, and the sun is the source of illumination and the source of truth and the source of good, then you're arguing that the world is, in fact, a certain way. Whether or not you see it is another matter. So the people inside the cave aren't seeing the truth. They have all kinds of beliefs, right? They believe that they're seeing a cow and and a horse and people moving along, but they're not actually seeing them at all. They're seeing mere shadows. The truth, what corresponds to the actual world, is outside of the cave, and only the philosopher who was able to get out of the cave was able to see the truth which actually corresponds with the actual world. So now the philosopher who went outside of the cave and understood finally that there is a sun illuminating actual objects, now that philosopher has discovered the way the world actually is in and of itself. And so that philosopher outside of the cave has now true beliefs which correspond to the world out there.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you, Mike. I think that's an important point, and that correspondence um, is so vitally shown in Plato's Allegory, that those who are still in the cave are still ignorant because they have literally no way of having knowledge of what actually is out there outside of the cave. That he kind of posits, what would happen if the person who left the cave tried to come back into the cave and interact with his former chained fellows. And he basically says that they would laugh at him, and they might even try to kill him if he shows up and starts telling them that basically all this stuff you're seeing, just shadows. It's just a reflection of what actually is. You guys need to turn around and do some real work and come out into the light with me. They would laugh, or they would be furious, and they wouldn't believe him. I think that perhaps reflects a little bit of maybe Plato's own experience. I think of Aristophanes, who was, for those of you who don't know, was a Greek poet writing at the time of Socrates and Plato, who literally wrote a famous play called The Clouds, which was about philosophers, primarily Socrates, having his head up in the clouds, being separated from the real world. So I think that perhaps that was a little bit of a jab at the people who didn't get what he was trying to do. I think as well, though, that it relates a lot to another theory of Plato's, correspondence, which is that in the actual allegory, Socrates mentions that there are people out there who think that they can teach the form of the good, that they can teach this truth, and that those people are basically lying. And the reason he says that is because it leads into another Platonic theory, which is called the theory of recollection, which is, very briefly, is a belief that our souls are immortal, and they are always already imbued with the knowledge of the forms, and that when we come into the world in a new life, we tend to forget them, and that we just need to remember that nobody actually teaches us anything about anything that we would ever have any knowledge of, remembering that knowledge is about things that are always true. And so, therefore, it's a process of coming to remember them. Now, he also talks about the fact that this process is, again, we think about the upward path, we think about the struggle, is something that's only achievable by, or is only ever realistically achieved by a very small few. It's a possibility for many, but it really depends on your internal makeup and your commitment as to whether or not you're actually going to be able to get there, whether or not you're going to be able to be one of those people who's able to look at the sun and so to speak, remember everything, remember all the metaphysical, all the truths of reality.
Yeah, I find the theory of recollection a little more absurd than the theory of forms. I can understand the idea of forms, the theory of forms, but I've never quite got a grasp of the theory of recollection. It's really a bold claim. It's a bold, and it's actually demonstrated in other works by Plato, like in the Meno, for example, where Plato makes the argument that Meno is able to recollect things, like things about facts about geometry and so on, that there's no way Meno could have learned those things afresh, because Plato didn't, or Socrates in the story didn't give him enough clues, or didn't explain to him, didn't give him enough information to answer the questions, unless Meno was in fact recollecting things he already knew. But there are critics who have analyzed the Meno and claim that indeed there were hints given, that Socrates in his dialogue with Meno actually gave enough hints for Meno to be able to answer the questions without having to recollect something he already knew. But that's another matter. That would be an interesting topic. But the idea of recollection, I don't quite resonate with.
And to be frank, I don't. I kind of agree with you that I'm more sympathetic to some sort of forms, often called later in philosophy for our listeners, sometimes called theories of universals. That being said, though, when it comes to Plato's, it's the theory of recollection is kind of flushes out a little bit of the fact that Plato doesn't believe that we learn about the forms. Plato believes that we already somewhere have that knowledge in us, and that's necessary, because how could we ever make that? How could we ever make the jump if we only learned about the stuff in the world, right? Our empirical data. How could we ever really make the jump to come to know the forms themselves? So he posits that they're already there. They're always already in us. Theory of recollection is kind of the background, and it's kind of questionable background for sure. But it's the fact that basically the knowledge of the forms, it's already there. And so we already carry that, basically the knowledge of the sun in us. We just have to learn. It's more the process of coming to see rather than learning about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I would like to make a claim which arises partially out of Plato's Allegory of the Cave, but from other parts of the Republic, Plato's book. And my claim, might seem a little bit radical these days, is that Plato was correct that democracy is an unstable and in many ways an undesirable form of government. So I'm going to tie this to Plato's Allegory of the Cave and to other aspects of the Republic by Plato to support my claim. So Plato said that democracy is an unstable form of government, and the reason it's unstable is because it's very chaotic. So Plato talks about the undeniable beauty and attraction of democracy, in that he compared it to an embroidery of many colors. People get to show their colors, they get to express themselves and to pursue their dreams and pursue their hopes, and if we apply it to modern times, buy the products they want to buy and start the kind of business they want to start, and individuate themselves and so on. It's very pretty. It's an embroidery of many colors. But according to Plato, it's very unstable. And the reason it's unstable is because eventually a person will become democratically elected using subterfuge, and that leader will actually then take over and become an autocrat or become a dictator, and then that's the end of democracy. So in my view, Plato was making a comment that the big flaw in democracy, and big flaw in allowing citizens to vote for their leaders, is they will eventually get tricked, and they'll fall for a disingenuous leader and vote for him or her because of the chaos, and because the citizenry wants a way out of the chaos. They prefer a strong leader to the chaotic disorder that inevitably exists in democracy. So, uh, and I'm going to add some support for that is exactly what's happening in many parts of the world now. So we've seen previously democratic countries like Turkey, for example, or Poland. Some believe it's happening now in the United States. We've seen, a autocratic leader elected through the democratic process, who then begins to, perhaps along with his or her political party, actually dismantle the democracy. So maybe the U.S. is in a respite. We'll see what happens in the U.S. in the next election. But the question is, can democracy survive itself? And there is some evidence in the world that it can't. Another argument that I want to make in favor of my position that democracy is flawed is that when the leaders of a country are elected, who you are electing are experts at getting elected. So it seems to me there's a contradiction. There's a problem here, because who should be running a country are experts in running a country. They should be experts in the field that they're governing, whatever that might be. But instead of electing experts in governing, we're electing experts in getting elected. And those are two different things. I mean, we all know that if you watch television or look at advertisements online, what you're seeing are the results of marketing campaigns. And it's the same thing when in modern times, when you elect a leader, a premier or a prime minister or a president or a governor, you're responding to marketing campaigns. I mean, they pay a lot of money for marketing firms, and perhaps you're responding to the personality, or at least the public persona of the person you're voting for. But that's a quite distinct thing from a person's ability to govern or a person's expertise in governing. Now, sure, there's some overlap. I mean, if someone's an incumbent, you could say, well, that person did a great job governing, last time, so I'll vote for him or her again. But many people that are elected are not incumbents. And certainly that was the case with Donald Trump. And even people that are incumbents, when they are now organizing or mounting their re-election campaign, they're still employing marketing firms and marketing strategies to embellish and manage and probably rewrite their actual performances in their prior term. So I think Plato was right. I think that democracy is flawed. It's unstable. The leaders tend to be experts at getting elected rather than governing. And it's attractive, I understand. It's a great ideal to be able to represent yourself or to vote for people, who represent you and elect your leaders popularly. Now, my third point, in support of my claim that democracy is flawed and perhaps should be replaced with something more like what Plato modeled in the Republic, which was government run by philosophers, would be Plato's Allegory of the Cave. The Allegory of the Cave makes it quite clear that the average person is only seeing shadows, is not seeing truth, is not seeing reality, but mere shadows in very inferior shadows compared to the real thing, which only the philosopher being defined as the person that got out of the cave and got to the surface and saw the actual objects illuminated by the sun, and then came to understand further that the people in the cave are only seeing shadows, but now I'm seeing actual objects illuminated by the sun. That person that got out of the cave, who we're going to call a philosopher, is seeing truth, is seeing reality. And so isn't that person better equipped to govern? Shouldn't the person who sees the truth, who understands what's going on, who isn't being duped, or isn't ignorant, or isn't living in a world of mere shadows, shouldn't that person be someone who makes important decisions? Someone who knows the truth and makes decisions from truth and knowledge rather than from deception and ignorance. And Plato, in the Allegory of the Cave, talks about how the philosopher who comes back into the cave and tries to explain to the people that are seeing only shadows what's happening, and they want to kill him. They want to get rid of him.
Yeah, I
So,
think.
yeah.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah. So go ahead. Challenge me, Hale.
Well, here's what I'm gonna say. I'm gonna go. I struggle because, on the one hand, especially your first 2 points, I think that you are absolutely right on those points to criticize democracy in many ways, especially democracy in its modern instantiations, and perhaps since it's ever been, because Plato talks about the same sorts of problems that he experienced in the democratic, in his own democratic society, and let's just not forget that it was a democratic society being pulled by their inclinations that had Socrates, it would seem, so unjustifiably executed, basically because they found him annoying. Or a particular few people found him annoying, and they were able to convince enough of a jury to find him guilty. So I am very partial to current concerns around democracy. I think that you're absolutely right that modern mediums in particular, they pander to persons' desires, and their main goals are to get elected and to attain power, and don't necessarily align with the good, or the good as in what's best for society. On the other hand, though, I think my concern comes in with Plato's other option. I think what I'll say is that the philosopher king's ideal was a failure, and I think that there's a couple reasons for saying that. The first reason is that, interestingly enough, neither Plato nor the characterization of Socrates in any of the dialogues claim to be the philosopher, claim to know the sun, claim to know the good. Socrates is famously, through all the dialogues, and it would seem Plato seemingly too, through him, is constantly trying to figure it out, and asking people, and no one seems to know the answer, and he doesn't really get the answer either. And most dialogues end in aporia; they end in a dead end. And so there's that point of saying, well, look, perhaps the philosopher king isn't a real thing. There isn't that person. That person is like the kind of classic chosen one or chosen few, and we know that rarely seems to be the case. The other part related to this and related to the allegory is that perhaps it goes back to to know the good would be to be the philosopher king would be to know the good. To know the good, there would have to be something to know, because knowledge is always what it's based on, and that gets into the problems of the theory of forms. That the theory of forms is perhaps not actually the most accurate theory of what really is, and is perhaps more of a mental construct or interpretation for us to be able to make sense of universals, which we find in our own language, things like, blackness or rightness or wrongness, and that there isn't some sort of independent entity version of those, some form version that we actually get to attain. And if that isn't the case, then there isn't a content of knowledge in the way that we think there is for the philosopher king to actually have that they could then use to guide the society in the right way. So that's initially what comes to my mind when it's brought up, is that it's really the third point. It's Plato's expression. And to end that, I'll say that, Plato did try. Plato to kind of be that person. Plato went to, I believe it was, I want to say it was Sicily, but I'm not 100% sure that. But he went to a Greek state, and basically tried to become one of the leaders. He became the advisor of a king and tried to teach that king philosophy, and pull that whole process, and make a ruler into a philosopher. And it was a failure, and it was an abject failure. And he went back to Greece with his tail between his legs and was very, very unhappy with the whole experience. So that's kind of my response initially to it.
Yeah, if we get away from Plato and theory and that kind of thing and go to practical examples from contemporary times, I believe my claim still holds up. And so without having to argue about the theory of forms and the good and the allegory of the cave, I can still make my case by saying this, which is that although economic systems and political systems are distinct, I do believe that there's a close relationship between capitalism and democracy, and I'll tell you why. Because capitalism and democracy are both based on an ideal theory. Maybe it's a theory of forms, right? But the pure ideal of capitalism is that competition is healthy because people will compete to make a better widget at a lower price, and whoever makes the best widget at a lower price will sell more widgets and therefore will succeed in an ideal capitalist system. And likewise, in an ideal democracy, whichever politician best represents the desires and will of the people will succeed. So in the capitalist system, those who make inferior products or charge too much for their products will fail in the competitive marketplace. And in an ideal democratic system, politicians who don't represent what their constituents want or prospective constituents want, or are not good leaders, will fail. And that will leave us with, if we had a capitalist democracy, that would leave us with superior products at lower prices and excellent leaders. The problem is, I don't think it works that way, and here's why. Because the systems get infiltrated. So the capitalist systems get infiltrated with advertising and marketing, where false perceptions are created. So what you're buying in a capitalist system is no longer the product itself, it's the perception of the product, which is created through skillful marketing. So marketing and advertising itself becomes a product of the capitalist system. So you have marketing firms now who to do such a good job of creating imagery which is sometimes completely unrelated to the product that is being sold, or completely dishonest or deceptive. You're buying that thing, not the actual product. And likewise, in the case of a democratic system, the politicians employ marketing. They spend thousands and millions of dollars, hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars in hiring the same marketing firms or similar marketing firms using the same strategies to create images, create personas, which may have nothing to do with, or little to do with, the actual product, or in the case of a political system, the candidate, right, that they're selling. So I think that's the fatal flaw in both capitalism and democracy, which is that it becomes blurred what's reality and what's perception. What's the real product? Who's the real politician? And what's the image that's been created or the persona that's been created, and it's very difficult to prevent that. There's attempts to do it. And, in capitalist systems, you have regulations and laws to try and prevent deceptive marketing, and there's fairness laws in democracies and attempts to somehow regulate dishonest campaigning, but I don't think that those are sufficient in either case. So I think that democracy is a great idea, like Plato said, embroidery of many colors, but in practice, I'm going to argue, and I know you were saying in practice Plato's alternative might not have worked, but I'm going to argue that in practice, democracy doesn't work because of the inherent problem of ignorance. People are ignorant because they're responding to marketing, not to the actual thing. So Plato's Allegory of the Cave stands up. You're voting. When you go to Walmart, you're buying shadows. When you go to the ballot box, you're voting for shadows.
Yeah, and you know what? This is, like I said, I struggle with this conversation, Mikey, because in many ways, I am very partial to your view. I agree that especially democracy plus a modern neoliberal capitalist system like we have today is ripe for manipulation of power, and that's done through pandering to people's ignorance and to people's desires, and there's all sorts of very sophisticated ways in which we do that, and I think it's only getting worse. That being said, I still struggle with Plato's alternative. I do not think that he really offers a coherent second option. And I do want to say that while democracies are clearly, especially in their current instantiations, a lot of them are not doing well, that the proof is in the pudding of the fact that while many of them are sick, they are here. And so to what degree do we determine what is functioning and what is not? If something is barely functioning, is it still functioning to some degree? And I think, though, that sometimes our view gets a little swayed because our paradigm case, which is the United States, is perhaps sicker than others because the United States our United States version of democracy is so, quote unquote, democracy, is so rooted in modern forms of capitalism that it becomes very, very, very messy and difficult to see how the two are separate in any way or form. I don't know if is quite as true when we look at other examples, like certain countries in Europe, particularly in Northern Europe and stuff like that, where there is a much stronger emphasis on societal protection from those sorts of harms. But yeah, that's my initial thought.
Yeah, another way of looking at democracy or not is the idea of stable equilibrium. So imagine a pendulum, and the pendulum reaches a stable equilibrium when the arm falls to the bottom and it's facing straight down because gravity, is pulling the pendulum down. That's a stable equilibrium. It's going to sit there until some force pushes it up. But when a force pushes it up, the force has to keep acting on it to keep it up. And as soon as that force, subsides or someone overcomes that force with a stronger force downwards, then the pendulum's going to fall back down to its stable equilibrium. So if you think about it like a clock, the 6 o'clock position. I don't even use analog clocks anymore. Is that a 6 o'clock position on the top? it's not stable. The stable equilibrium would be when the hand falls to the bottom. So my point is that is democracy a stable equilibrium, or is democracy an unstable equilibrium? Is it a transitional or a temporary state of that pendulum? So I think Plato was arguing that it's not a stable equilibrium. Plato argued that a tyranny is actually a stable equilibrium, because when you get the tyrannical leader who gets elected in a democracy, then that tyrant gets a lock on society, and things remain that way until there's a revolution or something like that that disrupts the equilibrium. But eventually, it'll fall back down to the stable equilibrium, which is the tyrant. So you could have a revolution, people rebel against the tyrant, and they say we need to form a democracy here. We need to have a democracy, but that would be unstable. And the stable equilibrium is reached when a new tyrant gets elected in that democracy. So I think there's a lot of evidence that that's true. I mean, if you look at the world, how long have democracies ever lasted? I mean, you had the Athenian experiment with democracy, of which Plato and Socrates were part of. You had some other examples throughout time, but they never lasted very long. And there's a lot of evidence now that the world is moving away from democracy toward authoritarianism or autocracy. And we don't know for sure what's going to happen in the United States or Turkey or other countries, but I think most observers and analysts now, if you do some research, are talking about the move away in the U.S. and much of Europe, the decline of liberal democracy. So there's some evidence now that we're seeing that happen. So I don't think democracy is a stable equilibrium, and you see that, and the idea of capitalism isn't stable either, because and if you put democracy and capitalism together, which seems to be common, that's definitely not a stable equilibrium, because what happens is, if the rules are set up in a democratic society such that everybody has an equal opportunity, then inevitably somebody is going to gain more wealth and more power, and then use that power to change the rules. So rules which are equal, rules that are structured, laws that are structured to create a democratic society, are subject to change by the very nature that it's a democracy. And so it seems inevitable that somebody who gets more power than the other guy is going to change the rules to benefit him or her. So how can democracy be a stable equilibrium if people can change the rules, and if some people can get ahead of others, if it's a capitalist democracy especially? And maybe you could say, well, we should have like a socialist democracy where no one can get ahead, but you know how that's worked out also. Even in communist societies, there were people that got ahead, right? And they got power, and they got wealth, and so I think when we're speaking about this, I think it makes me think back to the cave. It makes me think back to, what was one of Plato's goals? And one of his goals was to find truth that was always eternal and consistent. And I think that sometimes when we start talking about politics in that realm, we enter a place of contradiction a little bit, because we want an equilibrium. We want something that's stable. We ask ourselves, what is the most stable form of government? What is the most consistent form of government? Et cetera, et cetera. The problem is that, governments, human affairs, are always in the realm of the cave. They're always cut off. They're always changing. They're always shifting. They're always, in a sense, shadows. And so I would say that, in a sense, Plato was wrong to think that there might be some ultimately stable option. Maybe for our listeners that sounds a little pessimistic, maybe even a little nihilistic, but it would seem to me, when we look back at the history of political states, what we find, what we observe, is that it is a history
of revolution. It is a history of evolution. It is a history of reform. There is no real, eternal, timeless, stable option. And so, in that sense, I think that, while again, I am very sympathetic to a lot of the concerns around democracy, as you kind of pointed out at the very end there, you said, well, we could have a socialist form of democracy or whatever, even communism, things like that. That just opens up. All those are open too in their form, in the way that they are reflections. They are a place, a doctrine, a practice concerned with shadows. In that sense, they are all unstable. So maybe philosophers we should just all leave politics and and go and hang out in the sun somewhere and just know the truth and be happy with that.
Okay, well, looks like our time's up, but yeah, it's a interesting topic, and I'm not afraid to advocate something radical. I'm not. Thank you for being the skeptic.
And thanks to our listeners for joining in today. It was a really good discussion. Thanks, Mikey, and we look forward to you guys joining us next time. Thanks.
Yes, thanks from the Canadian Philosophy Show.